different about tonight is that quite often our speakers come and talk explicitly about cybernetics, and we criticize what they have to say about cybernetics and disagree with it quite violently from time to time. Tonight's two speakers, I don't think either would claim to be an expert in cybernetics. They're going to talk about the challenges and things that they encounter in their working lives and the challenges and we're going to try and work out how the cybernetics might help. So what I want the audience to think about and chat about and contribute to as we go along is how we might bring the ideas and disciplines and thoughts that we have about how the world might work and help our two friends to work better in their worlds. And that should then hopefully lead to an interesting conversation. So Andy's going to speak for about half an hour. I will run the clock, Andy, and give you a 5-minute warning, but you're probably okay with that anyway. And then we'll stop him and take 1 or 2 questions for clarification, then move straight on to Tom talking about his stuff, and again 1 or 2 questions for clarification, and then we will spend the balance of the time, however much time we've got left, reflecting, arguing, debating, and exploring what we think about what we have heard. So without further ado, I think, can I hand over to Andy Champness? Andy is a barrister by profession, working as a chief executive, and previously a teacher, I believe, and a white van man. So he has a checkered history. We have been colleagues, friends for 10 or 15 years or something. So we know each other and have worked together on various things in the past. So Andy, over to you to talk about This Is Data and I Want Information.
Thank you very much. Just checking everyone can hear me okay. Fantastic. I've not got any slides because I don't have any information to share with you. It's basically what it comes down to. So I run the governing body of one of UK's police forces. The governing body itself, the Police and Crime Commissioner, is a single individual who is elected. I think everyone lives in the UK on the call, and I think everyone's in England and Wales. So therefore you have all had the opportunity to vote for your Police and Crime Commissioner. Whether you took it was a matter for you. I run one of those offices. That commissioner is responsible for setting the strategy, providing all the money, raising taxes to deliver that strategy, holding other people to account, like a chief constable, for delivering that strategy with the money provided, and engaging with the community in order to inform all of that. That's all they do. That doesn't really help you very much. It does mean that all of the kit and all of the contracts is owned by the Police and Crime Commissioner, but all the data is used and managed by the force, by the police. Now, I'm not anticipating anybody actually knows where West Mercia is unless you are into your Saxon history. But basically, my patch is all of Herefordshire, Worcestershire and Shropshire. We serve 1.2 million people across those 3 counties. We have just under 2,500 police officers and about 1,500 police staff. When I say police staff, that's everything from, cleaners and HR through to forensics and police staff investigators and other, control room and all that kind of stuff. Now, has anybody had any interaction with law enforcement professionally? I'm not interested in any private issues you may have had. Anybody worked with government or policing apart from John? James? Excellent. So a few people have got some idea of what I'm talking about, yes? So policing, generally speaking, isn't that interested in technology and doesn't call information information, it calls it intelligence, which doesn't necessarily follow either. That's also probably a misnomer. There are 45 geographic police forces plus 4 national police agencies across the UK. one of which is the National Crime Agency, and you get British Transport Police, the MOD Police, and the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, who you don't want to have anything to do with. I was once told by the Chief Constable of the Civil Nuclear Constabulary that if you see a problem at a nuclear power station, don't go running towards the police. They will assume that you are part of the problem and shoot you, which wasn't very encouraging. All of those different 49 separate legal entities are on different systems and different combinations of systems. West Mercia is roughly 2% of police spend and activity in the UK. We are in the third quartile, we're sort of smaller than average. Policing is massively distorted by the Metropolitan Police and by the West Midlands Police, who between them account for 50% of it, just in those two areas. We have a total of 7.7 picobytes of storage capacity. Only half of that is actually used because the other half is mirrored, give us a chance of not losing it, which, would be bad. That doesn't include cloud storage. That's just the storage that we have direct control over. The majority of stuff, though, is in our control. There's only specific things like body-worn video that's kept on the cloud, videos that are taken by the public and uploaded for our access via national policing websites, that sort of thing. That isn't managed by us. We expect that our storage requirements to increase by 10 to 25% per annum. We are increasingly getting electronic data as part of the information we collect. 15 years ago, if there was a fight down the pub, a police officer would go and take perhaps 4 statements. The 2 people involved in the fight, 1 witness and the barman, and that would be it. And then they would make a statement of, yes, he had a black eye. That would be all. Now, you'd be investigating 3 or 4 different Facebook accounts, somebody's Twitter feed, and you'd be downloading a video from a WhatsApp chat, which would probably involve the detention of about 3 different phones, and then other people sending stuff that they'd found when somebody bragged about what a black eye they'd given someone via social media. So it's massively more complicated. We now have digital investigation tools in every police station, whereby you can take a phone, you can plug it in, you download everything, and then you have to weed off what you actually need. And then you can give the phone back. Obviously, if you're dealing with stuff like child sexual exploitation, stuff like that, and it's nearly all on a hard drive, you can have terabytes of data of people with awful photos and what have you. And there's a whole database about, what photos there are, and that is shared so that you don't have to keep looking at the same one, because that actually all 952 of the people you're investigating this particular thing have exactly the same files. But as I say, we have 49 different policing agencies. We won't get into the government ones. We hold different systems. West Mercia Police can access some of the data held by 8 other forces with whom we share one particular application. We can only access the other policing agencies' data by asking them for it. It's never a problem. They'll always say yes, but it's not exactly efficient. Our main systems, command and control, 999s and 101 numbers, dispatch, that kind of thing, are separate from and have to be capable of talking to our case management system, our custody record keeping systems, our large investigation evidence management tools, which are separate again. We have separate forensics applications, separate firearms licensing applications, and then about another 150 other applications that we use. We recently drew it down from 400 and something that we realized were completely useless. So that just gives you an idea, and that's just West Mercia. We're pretty typical. We are not unusual. A lot of those systems don't talk to each other. So you have the usual double keying kind of thing. But if you want to scrutinize the information that you've got, you have to go into multiple systems. Information tends to be organized on the POL data model, person, object, location, event. They're kind of the tags. And your data can range from something really detailed, loads of information on it, through to a bloke named Eggsy said he could get some drugs down at the Dog and Duck. And that's all it says. And that was lodged sometime in May 2018. You know, it's pretty unhelpful piece of intelligence, as the force would call it, and how you might use it. And you've got to be capable of correlating all of that. So if someone is undertaking an investigation into something, it literally involves an analyst sitting down and interrogating all of the relevant systems, pulling all that information together manually and producing a written document for a police officer who wouldn't want to spend the time accessing all those systems themselves separately, so that they can go out and then arrest someone, undertake some surveillance, whatever is appropriate to the individual thing. So, and those intelligence packages are also time bound. You know, they were done at a specific time. And frankly, 3-4 weeks later, they may be out of date and of not much use. So how can we access all of that data to provide better information in a timely way to an officer who's out on the streets, wandering around Telford, doing their job? Let's say they see a drugs deal go down. You don't want to interfere. That it's better at a low level kind of, you know, drugs deal. You watch what goes on, see who is actually trading for what, and then take it from there. But how do they know whether or not this relates to something that has been seen and done before? At the moment, it's pretty dependent upon him going back to the office, having a chat with the office, the police station, having a chat with his colleagues and saying, and them exchanging information verbally. My commissioner is responsible for just over £250 million spend. That's a lot of cash. The vast majority of it goes on police officers. About 80% goes on staffing. How much more could be achieved if we could actually work out what all the data we held was actually telling us? I'd love to know. We would love to get more information. We would love to be able to prevent stuff from happening. The police have got a good idea intuitively. You know, if I hang around the high street of any reasonable sized town from, let's say, 9 p.m. at night until 4 in the morning on a Friday and Saturday night, they're going to have some kind of deterrent effect. But so what? You know, what about elsewhere? Where else could they be that would actually help them, that would help other people? how do they make sense of that 3 petabyte of data? And that's just for 2% of England and Wales. How much data is held in policing if you multiply that out by 50? And I'm afraid I'm a lawyer, my maths isn't up to the job. I'll let somebody else work that out. How can we connect those systems? How can we connect the systems between police forces? I'm stuck. I want to say this surely must be possible. Microsoft and Google can listen to me and find out what I was saying if I was stupid enough to turn on my phone. And they would know exactly what was going on in the office and know all the secrets if we were daft enough to do that. Why can't we work that out? Beyond the obvious politics and economics of 30 plus years of data being retained on ancient systems that have gradually evolved through piecemeal investment and the use of market forces in order to try and actually generate decent systems that might work, which means that you end up with 3 or 4 competitors, or 2 or 3, depending on the niche, and then how those work or don't work together. That is my dilemma. That is the problem we all face. I can throw money at it, only by making people redundant, but which obviously doesn't go down well. But there is money. So Benjamin has sent me something. You can take your data and identify all the criminals as long as a high false positive rate is acceptable.
I'm just drawing attention to the fact that you're right in the sense about Google and Microsoft and so on. And there was a recent excellent thing where some people ran an ad campaign that identified, to you within, they tried to do it within Instagram, and Facebook quickly shut it down, but it just played back to you your categorization in Facebook world. And it just said, you are a single parent with just as the advert. But of course, they've got a much narrower framing and intention, haven't they? They only need a 1% success rate of getting you to click through and buy something. So yeah, it'd be easy to identify all the criminals as long as you don't mind 75% of innocent people getting swept up in that data as well.
I do mind. The whole point.
Oh, damn it! Okay.
I've got a chief constable with 2,500 people who obey their commands the vast majority of the time, with the lawful power to kill you, detain you, raid your home, listen in on everything that you've got, ruin your family life, and generally make life miserable for you. That is what policing has to be capable of, and they need strong counterbalance. That's my job. Mm-hmm. So a high false positive rate is not really acceptable. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I think the police probably know intuitively who a lot of the criminals are. It's getting the evidence against them is the trick, particularly on the serious and organized crime stuff. Yes, there'll be a whole load of people hiding in the background, but
can I give you just an observation?
Peter, I thought you'd come in, Peter. I've been waiting for you to sort of leap forward, really.
Well, there's a very obvious statement. This is the kind of problem that human beings can't solve, period. If you're trying to sort through massive amounts of disparate data, we only have one tool right now, and that's AI. It is absolutely superb. If you like, the ultimate pattern recognizer. And that's what you're principally looking at. You're looking for patterns of data and patterns of behaviors. And that is easily doable. The conundrum with multiple suppliers and different systems is rife in public service. If you look at the NHS, for example, just about every doctor's surgery has got some ad hoc system, and they can't share information. One solution is very obvious for the NHS. If you give the records, the medical records to the patients, one, they'll look after it better than the NHS will, and it becomes very transportable and very accessible, and it costs virtually nothing to do. In your case, you either have to employ AI to search across multiple databases, or you have to undertake some kind of consolidation. Because I've seen some of the nightmares where people have got software or even operating systems that no longer exist in large organizations, which is quite frightening. There's a surprising amount of COBOL still out there, for example, and getting that to migrate onto a modern platform is not straightforward. But somebody's going to have to bite the bullet on this one and say we're going to make a determined effort. But I would suggest to you that as of now, the easiest solution to go for to get you the fastest return for the lowest amount of money would be an AI system which could effectively search and correlate the data. By the way, my background started in AI started with the Vice Squad a long time ago, and my contribution to the war was to create a pink filter, so it was some time ago. I'll let you work out what a pink filter's for. Okay.
So if I can, I mean, I know you want to move on, but just
crack on, it's fine.
Okay, so very briefly, the first problem, which is bringing together all the data from diverse sources, is imminently soluble. And I presented a solution to that to government 10 years ago. The reason why they haven't done anything is politics, and mostly politics between, this was actually consolidating data between multiple vertical silos like NHS and works and pensions and all that kind of stuff to basically do an electronic census. And the reason why they didn't do it is you have people turning around saying the data belongs to us, as in the departmental structure, and where people own budgets within, like our Office of National Statistics don't want to give up spending X billions every 10 years to go and grab data. So there's a the bigger issue in what I encountered was one of, we don't want you to do it because it takes away our power. But it's eminently doable, and it's the problem comes if you try and put a single system in, which is what killed trying to do the spine for the NHS. Because what they tried to do was they tried to implement the same solution across the whole of the NHS, and it was too big a thing to swallow. So what happened was, I think it was BT running the project, if I remember, but you ended up with, oh, we're going to solve this problem in version 8. So you'd have somebody come to you and say, we want to do this. And they go, well, we've got that in the plan for version 8, but they'd say, we're only on version 2 at the moment, and we don't get to version 8 for another 5 years. So the whole thing was completely undoable. So the only solution is to actually, that will work and be cost effective, is to take all the systems that they have at the moment and shove it into one thing, but they carry on using the existing systems that they have. And that's eminently doable through a number of different methodologies.
Very quickly, James, so I have some history with spine and some history way back when with Peto. So with spine, I think that's part of the problem, but there's a more structural problem before that, which is healthcare, the way healthcare is organized into primary, secondary and tertiary care. And to the point that you're making about ownership, governance and all that good stuff. So it's not about having one system to rule it all. It's about having data standards. And there's an even more important question for us to think about, which is why? What's the purpose of police? You know, data is something to be interpreted, right? Data, I know in this kind of determinism is kind of coming back, but data is something data is interpreted and something to be interpreted. So you've got to have a purpose and a reason. So I don't think you want data, and I don't think you're asking for data. We want to try and get meaning and understanding. And maybe that example someone else gave earlier on, where we start to manage our own data, maybe we need to start making people responsible for sharing their data in a safe and secure way.
So there's a project.
I look after my own police record, then, Abdul, so I can modify it as I see fit. Caitlin, I know you're trying to raise your hand. Would you like to go, and then Jonathan Randall, I know you've got your hand up.
Jonathan had his hand first. You can go first for sure.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, a couple of bits. One on the purpose bit, because it feels like there are two purposes here, or two that immediately spring to mind. One is where there is a known or suspected crime, and it's about collating the evidence. And the second one is like identifying crimes, so ones that aren't on the radar, so putting them on the radar. So yeah, I agree entirely with the purpose. That kind of frames it.
Yeah. Can I add, actually, I would say there's four. There's also prevention, which is a tricky one. You know, how do you know whether you've prevented something? But it's better for crime not to happen than to have to mop it up afterwards.
Yes.
And the fourth one is around promoting the civil liberties. Police have a really, really important role in the promotion of particularly free speech, the ability to move wherever we want to go, that kind of thing.
Yeah, cool.
They're related. They're all related. Sorry to be really picky, but I think the purpose is really important, but I think the purpose is actually pretty well established.
Got it. And my second reflection is I'm pretty much with Peter in terms of it feels like AI, I think, is the best solution. Because when I think about, I mean, my background is I work for a large manufacturing engineering company. 20 years ago, if you were trying to get intelligence out of systems, you're pretty much forced down a consolidation route to try and get data in a structured format. Now, I think with where AI is at, I think it feels like AI is probably the more cost-effective way of doing that. And I think if say this was a manufacturing challenge where the data at each point drives action, again, there'll be a stronger case, I think, for consolidation, because it is about insight, and because of where AI is at, that feels like it's probably the most cost-effective solution.
The problem with AI, or as I think we probably should call it, machine learning, is it needs to learn, and it needs to have models against which it can learn. So unless you've actually developed the models, it's got nothing to learn against. And part of the problem which Abdul was mentioning is that you have a massive difference across all these people that are recording the data. So there's no conformity. Well, there's little conformity to the data. In the NHS database, you might exist 5 or 6 different times because someone's put a space in between your two names or a space at the beginning of your name, and it's all recorded differently. And one of the first jobs that needs to be done is consolidating and making all of those records match up to the right person, which is a hell of a job in itself because of the way it's recorded, especially if someone's going through different police forces. So, and then you need some kind of behavioral modeling. Now, there is predictive modeling that's being used, if I remember rightly, in America. I can't remember where in the States, but where they predict where the crimes will occur or where they're likely to occur on a percentile basis, because they've actually built up a massively complex model. But they've put so much work into developing the model. There's tools.
If I cut in there, James, if I may,
Sure.
partly because we're already doing that in a place called Gloucestershire, so not terribly far from where Andy lives. There's some people hiding in a basement doing that sort of thing with reasonable accuracy within a police force. But of course, they're not sharing their insights with anybody outside their own force, which is kind of unhelpful and maybe part of the point Andy is making. Caitlin, I don't think you've come in yet, have you? I'm just sort of looking at time and moving on.
No, I think my main points have been covered. I would question, like, I understand you probably do have quite established purposes already, but I might question that as well, as in whether those purposes are like well established in our working, I guess, like whether the police force is doing their part in fostering civil liberties adequately well, and do citizens actually feel that and trust them? I'm not sure. So I would agree with the others in that the data, it's a fallacy to think that maybe that you've got the right data in the first place, and you do have to focus on what are the processes or the purposes of the police force that you really want to strengthen with these systems, and then think about what kind of data and evidence supports those. And for me, I think the points that James has raised about the ONS and linking data or what have you, like I have worked with the ONS as well, and one of their strengths is really considering the risks of linking data, and there's all sorts of like rigid disclosure control and things like that, and often it does have to go to kind of Parliament just to be able to link some of these sensitive data together. But they do have quite a lot of knowledge about the risks of some of these newer machine learning techniques when you are dealing with institutional racism and sexism and inequality and things like that. But what you're saying about the police officers will already know who the criminals are, the community members will already know where the institutional racism and inequality is. So it is really about how can we maybe use some of these more innovative community relation consultation techniques, get them involved in governing this data. And what would that actually look like so that it's supporting prevention and crime, not just another tool for the police officers to use, but actually playing a part in generating these outcomes for you as well.
I get that, but I think sorry, John, I just want to come back. I think one of the things that the important step on though is the gathering of evidence to actually justify whether or not the police know who the criminals are. I know who he is, just give me a chance and I'll find the evidence to prove it. And we do have a saying that, a bad detective only finds the evidence they're looking for. If you're a good detective, you find evidence for all sorts of interesting things that might not be relevant to your particular what you're looking for, but you will find stuff out. And the community are the same. The community may well think that this is the case, and Johnny down the road is a right tearaway, but actually the evidence isn't necessarily there. And if the evidence isn't there, then we shouldn't be doing something about it. And that's, a rather important policing principle. Just as I agree with what you're saying, Kathleen, and we would love to have the community come forward. Again, there's an ancient aphorism about the public are the police and the police are the public. That's a very British statement, and British policing is very different from a lot of European policing in its style, and that's a fundamental part of it. But all of that then comes back to, great, I get more data. I've got loads of data. This data isn't the problem, it's the information, it's the intelligence, it's the what should we actually be doing?
That's a beautiful point for me to come in on, partly because I want to be able to come back to this, because where Andy started, the first thing I wrote down, because I do write things down as we're going along, the first thing I wrote down was governing, and the word governance, and so there are at least two informational problems that Andy is describing for me, which will link us into where we're going with Tom in just a minute. Informational problem one is, how do police officers use data or not in order to prevent crime and arrest criminals? But the second one is the governance question of how do senior police officers govern a policing system, and how does an elected commissioner govern a governing system that sits over the top of that opera? So actually there are three nested problems here to do with the way, so whether or not your 7.5 petabytes of data is actually of any lasted use at all is an interesting question. conversation. The fire alarm is just about to go off in my hotel room. I think it's chirping at me. So if I suddenly disappear, somebody else will have to take command. But the point about that is that we're going to move to Tom Dolan now, and then we're going to come back to this, how do we govern big data systems question, because the work Tom has been doing is to do with infrastructure systems, and he was privileged to get an invite to rock up at COP26 and say some things and listen to some people. And there we have a global governance problem with a global data problem, which probably makes policing look relatively straightforward. Tom, if you'd like to talk about your stuff, and then we will bring these two bits of conversation back together again in about half an hour and see where we end up. Is that okay? So over to you, Tom. I will just in case.
That sounds good to me. I'm paranoid that my computer's not working with my earlier things. Can people hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Excellent. So yeah, having been a presentation without any slides, I'm now torn. I've got too many slides, which is a typical trademark. Host is disabled participant screen sharing. That might be a signal to tell a story.
I've just made you a co-host, so you can share your screen now if you'd like.
Okay, I'll give it a whirl. Can everybody see what I can see? That's a silly question from beginning. Can everybody see a slide that says systemic infrastructure perspectives on the climate emergency? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, the area here's some sources. Basically, as John said, I was lucky enough to go to COP in Glasgow. It's the only time I've really left the house for work since the beginning of COVID. But I went up there, and I was lucky enough to go there as part of the Sustainable UCL team. And the day later, I released a paper that I've been working on beforehand. And so that's the top reference, and some other things that I've done before and after are included here. But it was John that tipped me off that information and data weren't one and the same, which as soon as somebody tells you is obvious, but until then is perhaps better hidden. So I'm interested in the climate emergency. So we know that 1.5 degrees is already inevitable. And we know that global net zero by 2050 can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we also know that if we don't do that, we will result in global warming of up to 4 degrees. So at UCL, I work on infrastructure systems. So I'm very interested in the role of national infrastructure, which I will characterize and which I have characterized in my paper. I'm very interested in the role of infrastructure systems, both as a driver and as a leverage point to respond to tackling global warming. And the impacts of global warming are going to be resilience challenges for society and for the operation of the infrastructure that enables society. So there's kind of a close tie-up between these concerns. So I'm seeing the climate emergency as an emergent wicked problem, and it's unintentional. Some systems that enable all aspects of our modern lives, societies, and national economies. So we get the plus side. Historically, these systems have evolved in the context where we're prepared to accept all the pollution, the greenhouse gases, the local air quality issues, the water quality issues, the waste we produce, our addiction to energy are all accepted as tolerable externalities, which we trade off against the benefits we get. But in a changing context, we're faced with systems that have been designed to assume that the atmosphere will deal with everything we throw at it, to the realization that it's not. It's an emergent problem, and the benefits we get as a society are directly linked to the outcomes we're trying to prevent, which is what makes it a sticky issue. So as I've said, it's not just a wicked problem, but it's two wicked challenges that are deeply interdependent, which we need to look at both simultaneously. We need to get to net zero by 2050. And if we do, that stops us, we hope, 1.5 degrees climate change, global warming from 1990. But even if we do that, we need to be resilient. All the systems that enable our society and individually, we all need to be resilient to the impact of 1.5 degrees. And that's not just the warming, but it's all the extreme weather events, it's the clustering of weather events, and it's the global migration. So there's a series of mega trends that we need to think about being resilient to. Even if we get to net zero, we have to be resilient to the disruptive impacts of 1.5 degrees. If we don't get to net zero, we have to be resilient to 4 degrees. So there's a large opportunity cost of failing to get to net zero. But perhaps if we do focus on getting to net zero, we can spend less on making our systems resilient to the impacts of global warming. Either way, both must be addressed, and they must be addressed synergistically along with other sustainability challenges, so local air pollution, waste production, water quality, health issues, societal challenges, probably along with levelling up, and they can't be addressed through single one-off interventions. It needs to be they're not technical problems, they're emergent problems that have technical roots, that have societal roots, that have government issues. It's all about institutions. It's how do we address them? And I think it needs the synergistic, and it needs a portfolio of multiple actions, including identifying systemically the things we do now that drive the emergence of the challenges and finding other ways of doing those. So we seem to be focused on, if we take electric vehicles, we seem to be focused on, we've identified driving as bad. We're trying to do a technical substitution, one thing for another, but without actually rethinking the system fundamentally. And I fear that we're trying to treat it as a technical problem, even though we know it isn't. This is just elaborating on why they're interconnected, but I think I spoke through that. I just want to cross some stuff out on slides, which I quite enjoy. So basically, the key message from me, and again, I don't think it's that profound, is our long-term prosperity, our well-being. These are emergent properties that depend on two characteristics of our societal enabling systems. So I focus on national infrastructure, but I think there are other systems that enable our well-being, that enable our economy, which, if disrupted, would disrupt the kind of lifestyles and quality of life we take for granted or have not been fortunate enough to normalise. So it's the resilience of these systems to the impacts of global warming, but it's also the ability of those systems to start to drive net zero success rather than carry on producing greenhouse gas emissions. So I went to COP, invited at the last minute, having applied and failed to get a place. So it was a great opportunity to engage, inspire, empower all levels of global society. Not personally, but obviously the event. And it was an opportunity to launch a moonshot. So the Council of Science and Technology has done work around the concept of moonshots, or Mariana Mazzucato on missions to a new form of economy, to perhaps a donut economy where we live within planetary bounds, but we provide a bare minimum that we need for well-being for every citizen. And I was fortunate enough to be in the blue zone, which was the bit that needed passes. So I didn't see Greta, unfortunately, because she I think declined her pass for that. But it was inspiring. It was uplifting. It was really holistic. There was lots of thinking. There was lots of energy there. There was lots of ideas. And in the 3 days I was there, I began to feel as though this is a problem we can manage. There's definitely awareness where, in the bit that I was involved with, that this is the type of problem it is, and that it needs kind of holistic solutions, and it needs the portfolio of solutions I was talking about, and it needs to think at the root causes rather than just technical substitutions all the while. But then, and this floored me really, when the Glasgow Climate Pact came out, it was clear that for all the positivity and the energy and the inspiration within the blue zone, that the challenge of getting 183 countries to sign the global pact to action had fallen well short. It was really a massively missed opportunity, and it felt like a backward step from the Paris Agreement, which was the outcome of the previous COP. And so the race to zero that had been trumpeted as part of the COP proceedings felt more like a stroll to zero or a brisk walk to zero, in the way that the Climate Pact had come to agreement. And the race to resilience, well, that frankly seemed more like a sleepwalk to fragility. So I went from being inspired, being quite disconsolate and feeling that we need to get to COP27 and we need to do better. We need to communicate that the climate emergency is this emergent problem that needs to be approached not in a fragmented way. And I've been umming and ahhing over this, but my initial reaction was that the actual pact that we came out with was mean-spirited, it was heartbreaking, and it was, for me, it was ecologically, scientifically, systemically, and economically illiterate. It was a false economy, and it was devoid of political vision or leadership. So my feeling from COP is that we know what to do, we broadly know how to do it. It's not going to be simple, but that we don't seem to be able to get the governance right. We don't seem to get over the fact that the marginal cost of doing business as usual is probably lower than the marginal cost of changing. And we're not truly valuing the cost of the externalities we're producing or the long-term disruption. So it was swings and roundabouts, really. But I think that in essence is the challenge that I'm facing, and my focus, as I say, is national infrastructure. So John, if I haven't spoken for far too long already, I'll just run everybody through a systemic characterization of national infrastructure so that everybody's on the same page as to what I mean when I'm talking about national infrastructure and why it's so significant for me in response to the climate emergency.
You have ample time, Tom, so if it's important, share it. You're well in hand.
Brilliant. Here we go. So I've just looking at national infrastructure. Obviously, my line is national infrastructure research, so I might be over-romanticizing, but I believe it capitalizes societal and economic multiplier effects. It enables a range of social and economic activity that simply could not occur in its absence. So not only is it important, but it's important that it is resilient and not disrupted as we face the impacts of global warming and as we face other resilient challenges. So national infrastructure has lots of positives. However, it simultaneously plays a significant role in determining the level of greenhouse gas emissions and the level of other polluting emissions produced by the society and the economies that it enables. So it's positive and it's negative. I think it has a big role to play in how we respond to the climate emergency. During COP, the Infrastructure Act in the States was published, and I didn't feel that there was any connection being made between what we do in infrastructure and getting climate emergency policy together. It feels like we have this subset that is climate policy and we have this other subset that is economic policy, and the two very rarely meet. One of the challenges is how do we bring those together? How do we get the qualities of net zero enabling, sustainability enhancing, resilience supporting into the purposes of the systems that we're making investments in? And I think the opportunity cost of not doing so is massive. So I think we need to transform our national infrastructure, and this is a real leverage point. This is a real opportunity to kind of catalyze change across aspects of the economy if we can communicate it and if we can get it right. So I think the decisions we make now with national infrastructure, not just in the UK, not just in the States, but everywhere, but it is in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, pretty much national infrastructure, the emissions coming from infrastructure are the scope 1 emissions, the fundamental emissions at the base of most supply chains, at the base of most global supply webs. We need to get infrastructure right if we're going to tackle this problem. So it can enable net zero or it can impede net zero. And at the moment, the way we make decisions, it's more likely to impede. It can enhance or it can erode sustainability. So it can improve efforts to improve water quality, reduce local air pollution and other environmental concerns, or it can undermine those. For example, developments in floodplains. They provide one service, but if they erode the drainage capacity of the other settlements, perhaps they're creating flood risk across the catchments. And it's how do you get the benefits without getting the trade-off? The infrastructure, we need to really think, and these need to be qualities that we prioritise as outcomes for all infrastructure thinking. And the same with societal resilience. Resilient infrastructure doesn't guarantee a resilient society, but infrastructure that fails regularly will cascade onto the society it enables. A society enabled by highly resilient infrastructure is going to be more competitive, will experience a kind of virtuous cycle compared to one that's infrastructure is constantly having niggly failures that cascade across the system and out into wider society. So it doesn't guarantee a resilient society, but a resilient system of infrastructure is very positive, I think, for the economy. But resilience is only seen as a cost, and it's fragmented. We expect operators to invest in it rather than it being seen as a public good for the economy as a whole. So just in terms of, I look at national infrastructure not as a set of individual sectors, but looking at all the economic infrastructure, so the roads, so the transport, the digital, the water, the sewage, the energy, and the waste management, all these economic infrastructure sectors, if I look at them together, and the reason I do that is some work that John did himself, looking at interdependencies between these sectors, and really no output that we traditionally associate with any sector, so no power, no transport, no potable water could be produced by one sector operating in isolation from the others. Each sector has at least one absolute and continuous interdependence with another. So for me, rather than characterising the system as a set of sectors that we manage and regulate and govern independently with assumptions about the others not going to be disrupted when we have these climate events, or the others are going to be constantly providing a guaranteed flow of inputs into our sector, is naive, and we're setting ourselves up for problems with resilience and creating costs in one place only to have to solve the problem in another, the savings in one place and solving the problem in another. So the interdependencies angle is what's leading me to think in this way. And interdependencies aren't just potential sources of system failure. They're actually, the system is kind of oiled by these interdependencies. The skillful management of the interdependencies between sectors allows the flow of goods, it allows the flow of services. It really, if we can get that right, we can improve the performance of the system as a whole. But if we get it wrong, it creates vulnerabilities to failures that if something goes wrong, the cascade impacts will be across the system. The infrastructure produces a predictable flow of products and services, and these act as enabling inputs. As I've mentioned, none is produced by an individual sector in isolation. The system itself, all those sectors, it's an autocatalytic system. None can really operate in isolation of the others, even though we talk about them as isolated systems. And the whole lot is a finely balanced cascade success. So it's inherently vulnerable to cascade, common cause, or escalating failures. So the types of failures that would start in one sector or with one component and span through the system, all could start with a natural event that impacted multiple points in the system and then have multiple cascading failures, or the escalating failures, which kind of link to if the infrastructure itself is in poor condition, the impact of a disruptive event will be far greater than it would otherwise need to be, because the failure will be escalating, building on a previous event or a previous common practice. And so the flow of infrastructure products and services enables social infrastructure provision, so healthcare, education, everything of that nature, public buildings, local government, central government. And this all then enables and catalyzes. So coming back to what I said earlier, economic or societal activities are catalyzed by the reliable operation of economic infrastructure. And really then, I'm going to skip through this bit. So does everybody else see the black bar at the top of the screen, or is that just my screen? Hopefully that's out of the way. So the outcome is societally beneficial infrastructure-enabled outcomes. So it's everything that a reliable economic infrastructure provides the foundation to enable. But as I've previously said, it also leads to so the societally beneficial outcomes, the wider societal activity, the society. Sorry, I have too many slides. I'm increasingly going around to Andy's school of thought of knowing what you want to say and not having pictures. However, it also gives rise to these undesirable emergent properties. So the level of solutions produced by the society, the economies it enables, the level of flood risk. Infrastructure may enhance flood risk, so reduce flood risk, or it may cause greater flood risk, or it may be doing both. And then the resilience of the society enables as well. So there's undesirable outcomes for greenhouse gases and local air pollution, water pollution, waste are amongst them. And it's all embedded in a dynamic context, the external context, which provides a flow of, infrastructure provides a flow of products and services to the wider economy, which enables activity that can otherwise take place. The infrastructure itself is dependent on a flow of enabling factors from the wider economy, and global warming, 1.5 degrees, 4 degrees, whatever it is going to start undermining these. So the supply chains that infrastructure depends on, or the very physical ambient environment that infrastructure depends on. And disruption to these will make disruption to the infrastructure more likely and will make resilience of the system more important. And so it's a real challenge prioritising resilience of the infrastructure system and recognising its value. And then that potentially can cause cascade across the whole system of the infrastructure, which will then affect the societally beneficial outcomes enabled or the economic activity enabled. I hope I'm not being too abstract or rambling or repeating myself.
I was saying you've got 2 minutes, Tom, really.
2 minutes, that's good. So I've distinguished between then the intrinsic resilience of the infrastructure, which we need to prioritise, which we can do by looking at the infrastructure and its performance, and the resilience challenges we need it to be resilient to. And it's the mechanisms through which these challenges hit the system and how they cascade through the system. When we look at generic ways of doing that, it can be resilient to multiple different challenges. So we need a intrinsically, systemically resilient infrastructure system to the impacts of global warming. And resilience challenges are just any event, decision, trend, or other impacts which have the potential to cause these types of failures that I mentioned to the infrastructure system. And I think I'm going to stop there, but basically, systemic resilience, I would just, having said I'm going to stop or not. Systemic resilience is multifaceted, it's dynamic, it is contingent, it's emergent, and it's intrinsic. It's the quality of systems, and it relates to the degree to which any system is able to reduce the frequency, scale, speed, and duration of disruption initiated by the resilience challenges it faces. So to be more resilient than your neighbour is beneficial, not just for you and in the short term, but in the long term as well. So it really is an abstract concept, but with very practical, real, tangible value. Anyway, that's hopefully I've outlined the problem I'm looking at. I'm interested in the climate emergency, the role infrastructure plays in driving it, goal systemic perspectives are needed to address it, and the role infrastructure can play in being more supportive of solutions rather than driving the problem on the one hand, and then we have separate policies trying to address the solution, address the problem that we're carrying on driving by not integrating the two. So I'm going to stop mercifully now.
Promise?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Okay, I mean that's a very fast romp through what I know is an enormous body of work, Tom. So that's it's splendid. Where I got to in the end, as I was sort of listening and writing down lots and lots of things to argue with you about, as always, as I'm sure other people have too, was I ended up thinking that national infrastructure is a dysfunctionally cybernetic system because it lacks the rules of governance around itself and data that would enable us to do the things that you're describing. And I thought that's just actually the same problem as Andy was describing, but on a different, on a planetary scale as opposed to a 3-county scale, which is policing seems to lack the will to govern, the capability to govern in a meaningful way and exploit the inherent cybernetics of the fact that both of these systems are working with substantial quantities of data, but failing to take any action associated with it. So what I'm interested in now is what's our collective or individual views on how we start to tackle this sort of dysfunctionality that sounds to me like it's evident. So who'd like to pitch in? Angus, I'm delighted to see you eventually got into the room. Apologies that there was difficulty with the Eventbrite thingy, and Bill, you eventually made it as well, so nice to see you both here. So who'd like to go first? Having said that, Angus just disappeared. Oh, there you are. Anybody want to come in? James.
Yeah, I'll be controversial. I don't mind. So taking a sort of personal view on this, there's two separate issues. One is climate change, and the other is the effects of climate change. So, if you looking at how much we pollute in the UK and reading a lot of the projections of the government. And international projections, unless we stop China, the US, India and the Russian Federation, we're wasting our time because we're only 1% of the problem, and they're about 55–60% of the problem. So firstly. Secondly, I would say that what infrastructure we require depends on which approach we take. So whether what we're trying to do is enable existing behaviours to continue, or whether we're trying to change behaviour such that it decreases the effect on the environment. And if I can illustrate that, if you want to change behaviour so that it stops pollution, you put, for example, you put in a massive broadband network and get everybody to work from home or similar. If you want to enable everybody to flow around the country, you're having to put in a huge road network and transportation network, and then deal with the way in which they move around. And as a side note, it seems to be becoming quite accepted that electric cars aren't the solution, because you can't produce enough batteries, there isn't enough power, and there won't be enough charging stations at motorway service stations to be able to stop for 2 hours and charge them up, because just the volume of space that will take up and the infrastructure is too great. So just as a bit of a controversial hand grenade, which I'm not really known for, and I shall now retreat.
Perish the thought. I think it's so I wrote down, just to cheer you all up, net zero is a fraud, because if the temperature goes up enough to kill us all, then being net zero 3 years later really isn't going to help any of us, is it? So I'm sort of a little bit on the same page. Where does that take us? So there's a governance question sitting in there. What are we trying to do? How are we trying to do it? That I think affects both of these conversations. John Oakland, I'm looking at you because I know your organisation has been doing a lot of work with a lot of organizations around how they make more intelligent use of the data they already hold. So perhaps you have something you can share with us.
Well, I think organizations are collecting huge amounts of data that they're not using very well. They don't have the infrastructure in the data analytics world that they need to do that. Organizations like Network Rail, which of course run highly complex projects all over the country on the railway system, and have myriad of data on those projects. And a lot of that past data can help them in how to manage the future projects and work out how to predict cost, how to predict whether they're going to be on time or late or whatever. And we have observed their lack of understanding and internal ability to develop the right models, the right machine learning tools, the artificial intelligence tools, for example, to combine the technology, process, people, to put that triangle together to manage projects properly. And those approaches can be used in, for example, Yorkshire Water, in the management of sludge, which I can tell you is a highly complex issue. It sounds horrible, but it's very important. In Vodafone, to tell them all about their business, who's opening new accounts, where and when, and indeed in police work and in the ESG world as well. So there is a lot of scope in the data analytics side, and the key is to get the integration of the data scientists, the data engineers, the data analytical people with the business people, who find them speaking often in a different language, to engage the two sides together to construct something that will work in that project or that investigation or that water management system, whatever it is. I don't want to go into detail, John, about which techniques and this and the other, because it's just too much. There's too much to go at. But in any environment, if you get individuals with an understanding of that business, the processes, the people in it, and the data context, the governance, the assurance, the improvement, you can make real strides forward in terms of managing those, organizations better. So that's all I would say, really, John.
Thanks, John. Because I think what comes into my head when I listen to that is, yes, it is a governance problem, but it's a people governance problem, a behavioural governance problem, more than it's a data problem. In fact, so what you're arguing is we can process the data, but we've got to have the right people asking the right questions. Absolutely. I mean, I didn't just say governance. So it's like anything else. If you take out the governance, things collapse. If you take out the people issues, it will not work properly. If you haven't got a decent process, you don't understand that process, you don't understand how the data flows out of that process and how you need to analyze it. But it's not doing more of what was always done. It is embracing the new data analytical world. I've not worked in this area in police forces. We've got a new project from the Chartered Quality Institute, I'm pleased to say, just started, on the future of assurance. And that's the whole business of assurance, not just quality assurance, if you like, but how do you assure that what you've set up and planned to do works? Banking, for example, look at banking, how that has changed. We've all been eliminated as customers. They don't know about us, do they? Until you find, and this happened to us, we all got paid 3 times 1 month, which was a nice thing, but somebody's going to come for the money eventually. Then they told us they didn't know how to get that money back off us. And then 5 months later, it suddenly disappeared out of our accounts. It actually happened to be the week before Christmas, which is brilliant timing. You couldn't make this up, could you? But there they are with their systems, and they have these automated processes, automated systems. But somehow you think, I don't trust this. And when you don't trust the connection between the governance of the organization, the processes, the people, the data, and you've got somebody who can see all that, how that all links together, then you're potentially in trouble. And I think a lot could be done in the 2 areas we've heard about tonight with these approaches. So might we argue then for both, and I shall look at Andy and Tom to come back in here probably. So if we looked at you, Andy, I'm just sort of thinking of the, you've got little terminals and things in every cop car that's out there. So people have access to data, but A, are they at an operational level asking the right questions? B, what support have they got? You talked in your session about having data analysts or some equivalent thereof. You know, I don't know where they sit and how your ordinary coppering person sort of communicates. Because you talked about a report, which is a very sort of Victorian concept for most of us these days. So do you want to talk a bit? Can you talk a bit more about that? You're on mute if you're saying anything.
I wasn't yet. My brain was working, but not my mouth. It's okay. It's probably better that way round, usually. In what aspect? From the governance point of view, or from the?
Well, it seems to me that you're asked. I think your problem, this is my interpretation, I think a problem is that data is being generated by systems. We don't know how to use that data to fulfill the purposes of the organization.
Right. So in my case, data is being generated by people. It's all coming through people. None of the data is automatically generated. It is put in by people, and I can't remember who it was. So it's talking about the inaccuracies that people put in data, because they put space in here, there, where I came across one guy who had 4 different driving licenses once because he was John Beckford, JP Beckford, John Beckfor, because they didn't spell his name right, and something else. You get the general idea. And he'd been disqualified 3 different times under those 3 different names. He never actually had a physical driving license because he wasn't that organized, and the system just couldn't cope because people put the data in. So people supply the data. That data is held. It's that how I've got all of this data. How do we access it? How do we marshal it so that it is usable, useful information, as opposed to enormous amounts of snippets?
So let's take this up to a higher level. Do collectively we actually want to solve the problem that Andy and Tom are talking about? Do we actually care enough, A, about the planet, and B, about crime, to make the investment in, picking up Tom's word, system transformation that might enable us to tackle either or both of these questions? And if not, why not?
I have a common objection, if you like, to no, we don't want to solve that. And that is basically, we just don't trust people to use it properly. And there are obviously occasions when that is a fully justified perception. Wayne Couzens in London would be a good illustration. But that's the point of good governance, isn't it? That is the point of having arrangements supervising that, having clear purposes, as per one of our discussions. I don't know, but I am guessing that if we were to, do something along the lines Tom was describing, somebody somewhere would be exploiting that for commercial purposes. Well, that's up to us as a collective to allow that or not. One of my biggest problems is social media. It's ungoverned, it is unpoliced. People can, it's so much, illustration. Oh great, my son's home has just decided to turn the light out on me. Thanks, Ben. One of my problems is children. Oh no, wasn't where I was going. It was during the demonstrations, I think it was 2010 in London. Met Police had their helicopters up and they were watching where all the crowds going. The crowds weren't going where they were supposed to go. The crowds knew what was going on before the police did, because the crowds were making best use of social media. They were all using hashtags on Twitter and stuff, though this is outside my expertise. And they were saying where the helicopters go, and they had better visibility because they had thousands of people looking and sharing about where the copters were. And the police copters obviously had limited visibility because the buildings got in the way. That's 12 years old now, whatever. The police have learnt from that. But it is so easy to organise an illegal sale of some illicit material via the internet, exchanged through Facebook or Twitter or whatever. It's unpoliced. It is not regulated. I wouldn't want lack of freedom of speech, but I need to be able to see what people are organising in order to be able to do something about it when they overstep the mark and decide to blow up Parliament or whatever it is.
So I think it was Buckminster Fuller, probably quite a long time ago, who said, you know, the only guarantee of our freedom is the incompetence of the state in dealing with our information.
In which case we're really safe.
Yeah, so so we're really good for the time being. But you know, I can't remember, it might have been Buckman. I think it was him, but it might have been somebody else. So I might be misquoting if one of the experts in the room knows better than I do. I've got two participants with their hands up, Mr. Randall and Mr. Bryant. I think Mr. Bryant, you were first, I think. So if you go.
So just to follow on from what Andy's saying, I dropped a document in, or a link to a document, which is the Global Strategics Trends 2050 defense analysis, basically. And what it does is it unifies the two conversations, because environment and obviously crime are part of that consideration. And the problem we're facing from a defense perspective, so if you look at it about sovereignty and protection and sovereignty of data, etc., is the world is becoming what the military describe as more asymmetric. So the threats come from unexpected angles. There's a whole language around threat beasts of black jellyfish and black swans and grey rhinos and black elephants, which is all very much fun. But basically, if we ignore these things and the interconnections, and COVID is in the document in terms of pandemic. Pandemic is one line. This was written in 2018. And now obviously everyone's thinking, my goodness, we need to kind of completely reevaluate, because it's affected things in ways we couldn't imagine. And from a cybernetic perspective, I don't know obviously what goes on in GCHQ or other types of areas, but all this is information. It's very well constructed, very thought through, very well considered and research information, but there's no systems model that if we do this, then it affects all of the other elements within what we're considering, and that's how the whole, you know, schema will change. So there's a lot of very deep, very considered, very expert thinking, but there is, because it's such a big model, there's a lack of system, which then comes to this type of forum. So it's worth a read if anyone's fancies. Either that would put you to sleep, one or the other. So
brilliant, thank you, James. So Jonathan and then Angus, please.
Yeah, just a reflection on the environmental piece, because when you kind of consider, yeah, in the long run, a fried environment means a fried economy, means a fried human race, all sort of all bundled together. But in the short term, it's a conflict between the economic prosperity and that longer term impact. So it's all the same impact, but it's short term versus long term. So then I kind of come back to, it's the time scale of politicians and the public that elect them. But I'm wondering, in terms of when we think about this from a systems point of view, is there a kind of intermediate bit that brings some of that forward in terms of opportunities? So if as a nation, you get further ahead in terms of technologies and techniques to deal with the environment, on the assumption that eventually the rest of the world will get there, is there an economic advantage? So can you kind of link more of an intermediate economic step that helps bridge the two?
So we incentivize people. Sorry, I'm writing a note so I can tell you you're wrong later. You're wanting, because you're an accountant, of course, you want to incentivize people to behave the way that you want them to behave, and you're planning to use money to do it with, even though Tom's just told us when the national infrastructure collapses, we won't have any. So, or if we do, but it won't be worth anything, maybe.
Yes. What I'm trying to do is to bring that forward so that we achieve the end game, but it's using that intermediate objective.
Okay. We shall see where that goes. Angus, nice to see you. How was your holiday?
My holiday was brilliant. Thank you very much.
Good.
Traveling over to Singapore was a bit of a lark at times, but it was a brilliant opportunity to catch up with family. Thank you, and thank you for letting me speak. John mentioned that I had some difficulty joining, so I'm afraid I missed the first speaker. Sorry about that. But I get the picture that what we're discussing is the quality of decision-making in respect to solving major problems. And in one case, climate, which many people perceive as a huge global problem involving everyone, and the other, perhaps more local, but it's a worldwide problem of policing and order and society and so forth. And I appreciate very much John's efforts on a number of occasions to ask the question, well, what's the cybernetics in this? And what's the cybernetics in this? And I want to make a small point about that, because way back when I was a much younger man, I co-founded and ran a business that became a world leader at the time. And it was centrally founded on the use of data to manage business organization in relation to customers. And after doing this for 5 years, I realized that the problem was not at a systems level and not at a data level. On a number of occasions since then, I've been asked to comment, and I've written about the problem with the use of data. But the issue, as I saw it, was not a problem of data, it was a problem of culture or skills. Organizations lacked the knowledge of how to use the data, and they were set in mindsets as to how you operate that did not make use of the resources that were available. Now, since this goes back to the 1980s and 1990s, I've seen absolutely no significant difference in the situation. The data's got more clever, and sometimes the computer systems have got more effective, but on the whole, we're not much better at using data today, and in some ways, probably not as good as we were back then. I might sound like I'm an old man talking about the past, and I probably am, but it seems to me that there is an intrinsic, perennial, chronic problem with this, and that's what both of our speakers and everyone else has been saying. So what's to be done about this? Because it turns out that to say it's a cultural problem doesn't solve anything very much. So the question is, what's to be done? So my suggestion is that if you really want to try and solve the problem of making best use of infrastructure and police, why don't you put quite a few millions of pounds into developing some excellent cybernetic education systems to ensure that we actually have a country that understands how things work? I think we have a really serious gap where people don't really know, for example, the way that the autopoietic organization of the living functions in organizations. We don't really understand the cybernetics of it, and we often end up in spurious systems conversations. So my recommendation is that those people who've got some influence, amongst the many, many billions that are poured into this, that, and the other, why not toss 10 million into a brilliant education program for the nation?
I'll open my mouth and turn the microphone on before I start speaking, because that works best, doesn't it? Thank you, Angus. Could you send the 10 million, please? It would be, I think, gratefully received and widely distributed.
Exactly.
Angus and I don't always agree on everything, but I would agree with him on that one. We need to develop a world in which we try to help people educate themselves so that they comprehend the problem, and then they might have a fighting chance of doing something about it. And for all the money we spend on education, we're not great at it, I think, at the moment. And I think that sits in a core problem that I think sits at the heart of this, which is that we design our organizations, sorry, Jonathan, around functions. So we have policemen and we have data scientists, and we have to get the data scientist to produce a report in order for the policeman to be able to do something with the data that he holds. So if our policeman was indeed a policeman qua data scientist, given the kit that he or she has in the car as they perambulate the streets, they ought to be able to distill all that stuff for themselves in something like real time. I'm looking at Professor Cochrane when I say things like this, and sort of distill decision capability out of the information that actually is already being held. What they don't seem to have, from what Andy was saying and from what Tom was saying, is a mechanism that integrates all those disparate sources of data into that singular report, or the capability in the individuals to be able to do it. And I would add to that the desire. Because actually, and I'm not going to have a go at policemen or indeed engineers here, but if you point to a hole in the ground and say to an engineer, I want to get to the other side of it, what he will do or she will do is design you a bridge or a tunnel or something, rather than actually interrogating the question of why do you want to do it, and it's getting to the other side of the hole, actually solving your problem. So we have a sort of massive set of assumptions about the way that these things work, and we don't interrogate them when we come to address them. So, our engineers are rushing around saying, look, we're all going to die of heat, we're going to get blown over by the wind, and we're going to get drowned depending where in the world we live, and we need to do something about it. And you might or might not be right, James, about 99% of the emissions coming from somewhere else, because the biggest challenge with that one is, of course, we don't count emissions from transporting goods and services around the world, so we just ignore them very conveniently. And as a massive trading nation, we have a massive influence on global emissions in that respect. And of course, our ability to do all this with data systems, we now, I'm told, and I have yet to be able to verify it, produce more damaging greenhouse gases from running computers than we do from running cars. So the energy cost of setting up and managing our data system outweighs now the energy cost of running our motor cars. So actually, if we want to ban anything and reduce pollution, we should perhaps ban computers rather than banning cars or banning internal combustion engines. And that's quite an interesting proposition, because it throws us into a different way of thinking about the nature of the problem that we're trying to encounter, because we're making a set of assumptions about it, but we're not designing our organizations to address it. And critically, the people at the top of our organizations, and I know Andy's PCC and he's a splendid chap, but he's not a scientist. He's not an engineer. So when it comes to a complex conversation about the way we convert data into information and then use it to make decisions, the key decision maker is not, back to Ancus's point, perhaps qualified in the area that we maybe need him to be, in order for him to be competent in the governance role. And that's not a criticism of any individual in any political position. It's a statement that says, you know, if what you've got in Parliament is all journalists, then what you're going to get is fairy stories. But their ability to convert the facts, if you like, the data that we're providing with into public policy, then becomes highly questionable. And I think that's, you know, so where can our cybernetics address these for Andy and for Tom to help them to engage with their communities to do different things? So Angus has suggested education, and I agree with that, but it's sort of fairly long term, and we have to start with, you know, my granddaughter who's 9 months old and bring her up properly, so in 20 years time we might be able to tackle this. What do we do in the meanwhile? What does Andy do to get more information value over the next 12 months, 18 months, 2 years from the 3.5 petabytes doubled of data that he has available to his 2,500 police officers, so they can prevent crime and arrest bad people? Because that would seem to be, that's easier than solving climate change, frankly. Not much, but at least we've got a defined space in which to do it. What can our cybernetics offer people? I mean, you're all cyberneticians. Genevieve, any thoughts? You're sitting there listening. I know you're with us.
Education is a long-term thing. That's true. It does take time, and all the more reason to get started, especially as we're talking about small budgets. But in the meantime, it's now well proven that there are really, really sophisticated analytical techniques for investigating problems and basically eliminating most of them. That's a fundamental principle of cybernetics, that you can determine what is the outcome you're trying to achieve and analyze it to the point where you can bring about a free flow of action towards the consequence you're looking for. This metamorphology or design principle for action and transformation is already existing. There are people who are capable of doing it. And there is notable successes that have been achieved in past decades. So it seems to me that when this is deployed at a high level, as it was, for example, in the last Olympic Games in London, huge transformational effects are achieved. And they could be achieved in all of these different areas today.
So we need the will.
It needs people to actually recognize that this, and part of that means that we actually have to be talking really deeply about the profound principles in which cybernetics looks at the problem and sees the problem in a different way from the way that systems theory routinely does it, or the way that functionalist management routinely does it, or the way that people who think that they have to reward people to make things happen do it, and so on.
So we shoot the accountants. That's a good starting point.
No, accountants is really important, but we need, the problem is accounting systems have been systematically redesigned very often to fail to give the kind of on the timely, relevant feedback that's necessary to actually manage. They tell accountants about information, about financial information, not managers and people on the job, what is the current state of affairs as relevant feedback.
Thanks, Angus. I think Andy named some of this fairly early on, because all of his systems are designed to capture data. Few of them are designed to spit it back out again in a useful format. And so we often end up, back to your design thread, Angus, we're designing ways of capturing stuff rather than designing ways of making decisions and then working out what we need to capture in order to be able to do so. And I think having had experience of the police information technology company at a national level, we may be offering some challenging things to them, because that's kind of not the way they tend to work, is it? James, your hand's back up, and Genevieve, I'm looking at you. If there's anything you want to add, I'll be happy to hear it. If you're happy, you're happy. So we'll go to Genevieve first, James, and then you.
It's good of you to call me in, thank you. I'm having a little bit of a problem with this, because some of you I can't hear very well, and that was true of you, John, not all the time, but before you asked me, so I couldn't really hear what the question was. But what I'd like to say is that I'm 86 now, and I know a number of you are coming on in that sort of direction. My main cybernetic time was when I was studying, and I've recently, because I'm doing my memoir, I've been looking back into some of my material from then, and Caitlin has actually identified that maybe next time or in a near future time, I could bring one of the papers that I actually brought back then, which is incredibly interesting now, because the situation has changed so much. But at 86, at the moment, I'm suffering some of the changes of age and memory and stuff like that make things a little bit tricky. But I'm very inspired by what I see of what I was writing then and how relevant it is to now. So I'll be looking up specifically something for you soon.
Brilliant, thank you. James, back to you.
Yeah, just to about data for a second. I mean, most organizations that I've come across in my sort of data commercial activity their problem is the data arrives too slow. So they're looking in a rearview mirror, which is very much in the past. So by the time they respond, they're obviously responding to 6 weeks ago, especially in project management. They're responding to 6 weeks ago. And by obviously the time they're responding, actually the context has changed. So the speed of data, which is all about collection and then transfer with the analytics bit in the middle, can be sped up in those kind of environments. It's a bit difficult in the policing environment, I guess, because you're trying to you're either doing prevention. So if we use Ashby's black box, you're either trying to change the inputs so that the crime isn't an output, or you're taking the outputs and then trying to determine what happened in the black box and who was responsible for it. So as a cybernetic model, that kind of works, but we do spend a lot of time looking at the outputs and trying to then, put somewhere away or address those issues, as opposed to being able to change the inputs. But the inputs are very complex, and we don't know. There are some information, but we don't know which of those inputs is necessarily causing what output. And then when you do, like for instance, you can look at a child and broken household, doesn't attend school, does some minor offending, etc., and then they end up in prison. And there are lots of milestones along that journey where there could be an intervention, but there isn't the money there. It's not applied at those points. It's only applied to lock them away at £80,000 a time. So we need the will to change where we address the issue, to design it out of the system so it doesn't become an output. But there isn't that thinking.
So would that suggest, James, that what we ought to do is have preventative policing as part of our educational process for children, rather than part of our policing service?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really policing. It's actually looking at those nodes where there is a predictable pattern. If you look at the people that end up in prison, there's a very large percentage of them that are illiterate. They come from the types of backgrounds that I've explained. They have this pattern of behavior that ends up with them being in jail. And therefore, there is a behavioral map that says, I can't remember the percentage, 40, 50% of the people that end up in jail go through these stages. And each of those stages, there can be intervention, but they're not necessarily coming to the awareness of the police. It's social services, it's the doctor, it's the teacher, and it's joining up that information. And as we've seen recently, such tragic things with Victoria Columbia is the one I remember, but the most recent ones where these children are abused and everyone kind of misses the signals and misses the signs, and 17 people actually noticed it, but nobody talked to each other, and they were all too frightened because of GDPR and whatever else. But there are patterns that you can pick up that would take an awful lot of crime out of the system if only we spent the money at a different place rather than after it's happened, to lock them away or punish them in some manner.
Jonathan, your hand.
Yes, a couple of thoughts on the policing bit. One is around purpose and aligning individual with organisational purpose. So it's like with any IT implementation, if you say, right, we're going to implement this new tech and we're going to make 20% of you redundant, immediately everybody's creativity will be focused on making it fail. But if you can do it in such a way as like, right, it's the same target, same level of resource, this technology will help you achieve those targets, you then get the creativity used to make it work. So one bit's on purpose. And the other bit is about the diversity and feedback loops. And I think it's that thing, if you don't necessarily just have one team working on the model, you could have separate teams, and you allow the diversity and then the feedback loops back from the practitioners and the rest of the system to then learn which is actually the best model or parts of models that you want to go forward with.
So my inclination is more aligned with Angus's, which is everybody should be a cybernetician, then they can be something else as well. But the kind of well, I mean, it has come up because work I'm doing in a different sphere, in an engineering sphere, has thrown up the need to help people to learn to think systemically.
Okay.
So that they actually, because I think the stuff Tom was talking about was about a global challenge with a set of global challenges nested inside it, with a set of infrastructure artifacts nested inside that global challenge. And it's difficult to get your mind around. It's very, very hard to go outside your particular functional box and embrace all of the complexity that's entailed in there, and then be brave enough to go and get involved in the argument. And I think, again, if you scale that down to whether it's policing at a national level, where we might argue, and this cybernetically, we might argue, Andy, that some policing services might be better provided at a national level. And we take, for example, you talked about child sexual exploitation earlier, and the replication of multiple images across multiple devices, across all moving in real time. That's probably beyond the capability of any individual 1/43 of a police force to go and actually solve. So you might detect, an arrest you're unlikely to prevent at that level because of the nature of the source of that sort of crime. So we might look at that and say, well, actually, one of the ways we'll give you better information to take some of your data away and give it to some people who can use it, which has a sort of political overtone to it, a structural overtone to it. But it then says, so the policeman wandering around Worcester or Hereford or Shrewsbury is targeted in terms of their attention at a different informational level in terms of the nature of the problem that they're trying to address. But the process of identifying bad behavior might be done somewhere else, with, back to that wonderful word report, information provided then to a local police to say, go and arrest this person, here's the evidence they've done a bad thing, which we've been able to trawl at a national level, applying the great thing about computers is they don't really care how hard they work, and they don't really care about how much data they process, as long as we give them the right stuff. So we could process data at a national level and address some of these things, and then point to the emergent result at a local police officer to go and take executive action on. That's a very different way of working, a very different way of thinking about the information. We could do the same, arguably, with data about emissions, greenhouse gases, national infrastructure performance, and start to address those things in the same way. That says, there's a local action which is required, but the data provision and the information dissemination comes from a centralized, a more centralized system. And I have to be careful with the notion of centralization. As a cybernetician, I'm a big fan of distributing control. But if you distribute control to the point where it becomes dysfunctional, then there's kind of no point to it. Does that make any sense to you, Andy? I'm sort of we're coming towards the end. So have you heard something beneficial in these 2 hours?
It's been useful to talk it through, and I think the biggest issues are cultural. I recognise that. I can't remember who said it, and that is why we are still where we are. It's people protecting fiefdoms. One chief constable can't tell another chief constable how to do things. There are 43 best ways of doing it, and all that kind of thing. So definitely cultural issues is a big part of it. Trying to break the problem down into that which can be solved at organisational level, regional, national, and sub-organisational is also something that we'd have to explore.
Cool. So that's good. That's two half decent outcomes. Tom, before I come to you, I'm going to go to Gerard because you've got your hand up briefly. It's the first time I've spotted it tonight. So do you want to pitch in? You're on mute. You're still on. Oh, there you are.
I think the conversation was very useful in identifying, let us say, general streams of cognition. So one of those streams is, of course, that you make a clear distinction between data and how you use it. And that, of course, is precisely what is the basic tenet of research. Always have different data from your hypothesis, because otherwise there will be biases. But in many organizations where people are dealing with real life events, things go entirely in a different way. So I would like to point out maybe the possibility of looking at successful large-scale organizations that do not make this distinction between data and how you deal with it. In the Netherlands, you know, I'm Dutch, there is a big problem with water. So water is being dealt with on a national level. It's also dealt with on a local level. But the organization that is dealing with it doesn't have large-scale databases. It actually has a lot of plans, and they are able to identify the type of data they need when they have a plan. For example, the Rhine has had to be redeveloped because too much water was coming down, and when it was channeled in the Netherlands, it overflowed. So now they have a very different system where the water is actually guided over certain meadows, so that such that the water is not coming down all at the same time. So the point I'm trying to make is not is that in this case, the main input to the system is actually an understanding what water is doing, what its effect on people are, and it's not data about the flow of the water in the Rhine.
Brilliant, thank you. And I actually get that. I actually understand. She's come encouraged by. Tom, any sort of final comment from you before we close proceedings? Have you gained something tonight?
Yeah, lots of things swirling around my head. But it's definitely reinforcing the thing around problem framing. It's how we frame the problem, or we often frame the problem as this is the data we have, therefore this must be the problem we want to solve, rather than starting with outcomes. But really the education and the cultural point, I do feel quite strongly, and I think when Angus mentioned it, that we take intrinsically curious natural systems thinkers and we don't teach it, or we teach it out rather than we teach it in. And teaching it back as a technical discipline at university level is way too late and way too niche. And so how we can actually get into my boy at primary school is studying life cycles at the moment. Everything is circular. How we get cybernetics and systems thinking aligned with the natural cycles thinking, the way we teach at primary school. So it's not teaching it back. It's almost having forbidden it and then teach it back. It's how we don't crush it in the first place.
I think that's a really good point. So I asked an audience once, how many of you have studied systems thinking? And one chap, and there's an ordnance survey event, one chap said, yes, he said, I did a module on systems thinking in my master's degree. And you kind of go, well, you know, the university didn't get the point either, did it really? It was just a little bit sad. So it is 4 minutes to 7 according to my clock, which means I've got to bring things to an elegant halt. The great news is that although you think this is all entirely random, there is actually some sort of a plan. And next month, we're going to have two different speakers. One of them is a chap called Chris Singer, who is an old colleague of Andy's. And Chris is going to be talking to us about leadership in the public sector. And leadership and governance is one of our key threads tonight. And the other speaker is a chap called Tom Jackson. Tom is a professor of information systems at Loughborough University. His big thing is, how do we make sense of data in systems like social media? How do we actually interpret what's going on? And he's got a program called Emotive, which has predicted the outcome of the last 3 American presidential elections accurately, which is quite fun. So those 2 talks, I think, will build on what we have heard tonight and maybe offer some different and new insights into the 2 spaces that we've been in. So if I can say, you put your hands together please for Andy and Tom for doing all the heavy lifting for the night, and say thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I hope we will resolve the challenges of Eventbrite, which I know got in the way for 1 or 2 of you on the way in this evening. By the time we do this again on the 2nd Wednesday in February. In the meanwhile, enjoy your dinners or whatever it is you're going to go and do now. And thank you very much to Andy and Tom, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.